Stephen, the L'Oreal Professor of Marketing at the Saïd Business School at the University of Oxford. We talk a lot about AI in business these days, and we also increasingly talk about things like ethical AI, responsible applications of AI, of course value-creating applications of AI in business, but also things like trustworthy and transparent and fair and so on and so forth. But what does all this mean? What actually is AI when we think about in a business context, as a starting point, let alone what is responsible and what we sometimes refer to as human-centric AI? So to answer these questions, I hosted a webinar recently with 3 experts on this and related topics. Dr. Natalia Efremova, who is a research fellow with us in the Oxford Future of Marketing Initiative at the Saïd Business School. She's the Teradata Research Fellow in Marketing and AI and has a PhD in Computer Science. Also Dr. Felipe Thomaz, who's an Associate Professor of Marketing here at Oxford and is an expert on thinking about data and digital transformation of marketing, but also the role of AI and privacy regulations in that space. And then Sophie Peresson, who is the Director of Innovation for All, which is part of the International Chamber of Commerce, which is the world's largest trade association representing businesses. And we're working with the ICC on research to produce guidance for businesses on how to most appropriately and responsibly use AI in business applications. So I had a chat to these 3 colleagues, friends, and experts about what responsible AI is and human-centric AI is. And as you'll see in what follows, we talked about a lot of things, from marketing to financial services to regulation to different global perspectives to algorithms to bias. But I think one of the true themes that emerged is that there's no simple solution to a lot of the challenges posed by these technologies. But if we're to really take advantage of them and see it as a set of new opportunities to fuel growth and actually societal benefits, then we're going to have to, as a business community, figure out and get our heads around what responsible human-centric AI actually means. So let's begin with Natalia Efremova, who I'd asked, actually, what is AI in the first place?
So the concept of AI is somewhat fluid. It tends to change over time and between industries. So there is no strict definition that we can refer to, unfortunately. It will be very different if you are in industry, if you are in academia, or if you're actually studying AI. So in general, AI is sort of umbrella term. It has to do with machine learning, all the concepts in machine learning, such as supervised learning, unsupervised learning, reinforcement learning, all the tools that have been recently developed to help in industrial applications and in academic research. On the one hand, so this is from a standpoint of academia. From an industry standpoint, it can slightly vary depending on where you are. Our recent research that Sophie will talk about a bit later actually showed that in different sectors of industry, people can mean very different things when they speak about AI. So in academia, we're happy to talk about AI as research and algorithms that we develop, but it's largely also data and how we handle data. And in industry, people will agree that 90% of AI is data practices, how we handle the data, how we gather the data, how we process the data, and only then how we apply these algorithms. From other application standpoint of view, it also has to do with legal concepts and GDPR and how we think about safety and privacy of the data. This is also a big part of AI. So AI is a very, very big concept that unites all these notions and can mean actually different things to different people.
All right. So there's no simple single definition, which I think we'll talk about a little bit in terms of some of the challenges. But Felipe, one of the ways I think Natalia talked about it was, in some sense, the academic perspective, a scientific perspective. There's algorithms, there's data that process that go into those algorithms, and data and other things come out of those algorithms. But when we're talking about human-centric, this is not just now, particularly if we think about business applications, about sort of cold science. It affects human people's lives. So what does that mean from your perspective when we think about human-centric AI?
Yeah, and I think that's made more challenging by the fact that it is such a wide umbrella that captures so much, right? But let me work backwards from the title of this webinar. And so I was like, all right, so it's for business, right? Like I'll start with, this is for those sorts of applications. Although scientifically, we can put it all over the place in all human kind of activities. But in business, we're going to inject some pretty exciting automation across a number of our processes. You and I might spend a lot more time thinking about the marketing processes that we're going to augment with these tools and how they're going to help us with decision making. So largely, you're talking about automation and acceleration of decision making at some pretty exceptional scale, right? So any business person is suddenly being very excited about the economic potential and upside of that. Then we have to to be concerned, the human element, then working towards the front of the title of our webinar is the consequences of that automation. One, if it's a very early decision, right, you're augmenting a decision maker's kind of mapping of the world, there's a certain level of risk. When you're automating a decision that immediately touches the consumer or an end user, somebody that has no power whatsoever to affect the decision making, they're just suffering the consequences of that automation of AI. That's where you're suddenly going to find a lot of risk. So the way that I like to think about it in terms of like, all right, so there's potential upside, there's absurd levels of money on the table in using this well. But the risk comes at the agency of humans, right? Your ability to self-determine, your ability to make your own choices and kind of negotiate the system. We are removing some aspect of that. And it opens the doors, we'll get a lot more into it, but it opens the doors for errors to then propagate at that scale and speed that you're using for the money-making aspect. And it can get out of hand really fast. So the human-centric, I think, for me, is one that has that awareness of the human consequence, and it has some sort of plan to mitigate that aspect.
Okay, a lot there, which we'll come back to. But Sophie, I want to come to you for your perspective on this. But I guess also there's perhaps more of a policy aspect to this as well that I know you and colleagues at the ICC and OECD and other organizations have been thinking about. So perhaps you can enlighten us a little bit on that front too, please.
Sure. Thank you so much, Andrew. And thank you for the invitation. I'm delighted to be here with you this afternoon. Very quickly, for those of you who don't know the International Chamber of Commerce, we are a trade association. We turned 100 years old last year. We represent 45 million businesses across the world, North and South, multinationals, SMEs, even MSMEs. We've been working with them more during this COVID pandemic. And as we like to say, we do represent the voice of business. Obviously, AI is close to my heart, given that I oversee the innovation department, which includes new technologies and AI in particular. And the way we look at AI is that indeed it does come with lots of opportunities and challenges, transforming all sectors of the economy, creating new opportunities for productivity, gains, and economic growth. Profoundly changing the R&D life cycle, which I think is quite significant at the moment if we're thinking about the R&D cycle for COVID-19 in terms of the vaccine rollout. But as with any type of transformative technology, it does create new challenges for society, especially in terms of human agency, transparency, and inclusivity. So what has been the ICC response to AI, and how would we like to be part of the discussion? Well, we'd like to put together, and that's what we've been doing with you and your colleagues, put together a foundational paper on human-centric and trustworthy AI. It sets, the ambition is to develop a set of principles supported by industry case studies and best practice examples that will help business implement ethical AI technologies. And concretely, we'd like to do this through gathering and reviewing existing principles on AI and distilling commonalities. We're not new to the game. As you alluded to, Andrew, there are quite a few international organizations, governments, trade associations, and just companies who have been very active on this front. So they haven't waited for the International Chamber of Commerce to wonder what to do. And we're working from that, and we have a lot to work from. We also want to demonstrate through case studies how business around the world, which is already active in the field of AI, are implementing the principles. I think there's a lot to learn there. Also, I think this is a good starting point to create a common language, a common understanding of how business has been tackling and working with AI. And we also want to identify challenges faced and good practices, because there are a lot out there that are, and replicable solutions on the implementation of principles. And because we are a global trade association that has UN observer status, and we're working with a lot of international organizations and in partnership with several governments, we want to inform our advocacy efforts in the international forum. One thing I just wanted to raise, and it's kind of the rationale of why we've wanted to come along and do this publication or do this research piece, is that we find that there's policy and regulatory discussions have been subject to either sector-specific considerations, and here I have in mind healthcare and finance, or issue-specific, data protection, cybersecurity, anti-discrimination, you name it, there have been quite a few. So they've either been sector-specific or issue-specific laws and guidelines, as well as regional and local approaches to establish guidelines fueled by concerns regarding ethical implications. And while that's very helpful, these increasing number of policy initiatives that are spearheaded either by governments, coalition of governments, international organizations, do create quite a few challenges. Namely, they could be ineffective, they could leave regulatory gaps, they could create an inconsistent or misaligned compliance obligations, which makes for a messy and very complicated scenario for business. We think that this can negatively impact companies, especially when it comes to their role in terms of obligations and implementing the guidelines. So I don't think we should underestimate the complexity that companies are faced with these varying policy frameworks. And I'll just pause there.
Yeah, I mean, I think on that complexity point, I mean, Felipe, you touched on it a bit by sort of talking about managing the risks of, I guess, unintended consequences. And you particularly were sort of focused on automation, but then Natalia, you also talked about sort of there's lots of different ways we can think about AI and lots of different applications, you know, and I think automation is definitely one of those areas where we can therefore scale things up, and you could have a lot of efficiency coming out of that. But I think that's also where things could certainly go wrong on the output side. But kind of want to come back a little bit to what you were talking about, Sophie, and maybe Natalia, I'll ask you to share with us some of the research findings on this, because as part of this project, and as Sophie mentioned, we here at Oxford Saïd and have joined up with the ICC to collaborate on really coming up with a set of guiding principles, if you will, for trustworthy, transparent, fair, human-centric and responsible AI applications for business. And sort of when we embarked on that, Natalia started out actually as a member of the team looking at what was out there. So Natalia, maybe you want to share a little bit about what you found, and I guess also explain how we sort of used AI to study AI, which is kind of cute, I suppose. I think Natalia's got an audio.
Sorry,
There we go.
I lost my mute button. Sorry for that. So yes, that's a very interesting finding that we have done. Well, first about the process of it. So what we have done, we have analyzed two types of texts and sources of text. First, we have looked at the industry papers published by large companies and organizations, which has to do something with AI and regulating AI and how to apply AI and what policies we should apply to AI applications in businesses. So it was quite a large corpus of documents that we have gathered through, I think, over 50 different sources. And we automatically analyzed those on one hand. On the other hand, we looked at the academic research. We looked at the last, say, 20 years of research, extracted main papers that had to do with formulations of what it is, what AI is, what is transparency, accountability, fairness, and so on. And we ran a few natural language processing algorithms to extract main topics in these documents, and sort of put everything together and compare what companies think AI is and what is responsible AI is versus what academia thinks that AI is and what is responsible AI. And we also tried to extract knowledge from different sectors. So we looked separately at industry and marketing and so on and so forth. So as much information from various applications as we potentially could. And interesting thing that we have found is that the topics that are widely discussed would be very, very different depending on where you look at. So in academic research, that would be almost always about algorithms, how we develop AI, how we construct AI, how we make insights from what AI finds. So basically about the process, about the development AI, and a little bit about consequences. But when we look at the academic literature, not academic literature, but sector applications, it would mostly speak about what impact it makes on our lives. And depending on the industry, it will be very, very different things. In some cases, it's responsible AI and how it impacts human lives. When we talk about law and legal applications, it's almost always about security and data protection and so on and so forth. When we talk about facilities, it will be how to automate some processes, how to make them more efficient. And there would be almost no overlap between different sectors. And I think it was particularly fascinating being actually able to observe that people are interested in very, very different things. And finally, we looked at news sources, and we have also found out that depending on the sector, it is very, very different thing that people like to talk about and what they worry about. And here we would have to do a lot with privacy concerns and dangers that AI impose and the consequences for society and for individuals. And also the fact that we need to regulate it and we need to describe it. So I think that was our main finding, that people disagree and there are a lot to address in all the domains.
Yeah, and I guess I think it's, so what we're hearing so far from all of us, I guess, is that there's probably not a one-size-fits-all approach, but at the same time, because of, say, to Felipe's point about risks of adverse consequences and you know, impactful negative consequences for humans, plus also what you were talking about, Sophie, in terms of the need, though, to have some, maybe not a really strict standardized approach here, but you know, I kind of think of it almost like, well, we do, you know, let's suppose we've got a highway, we do need to kind of mark the lanes. We do need to put some, you know, guardrails on the side. We can't just sort of have a completely open road that everyone just goes crazy on. So I think there's a sense of we need a foundational set of principles to help us grapple with, I would argue, an ever, you know, increasingly sort of complex environment here as the technology keeps evolving. And it's obviously a very global thing. It's obviously a multi-sector thing, and so on. So we're talking about actually a really complex problem here. Let's now bring it, though, kind of down to earth, I suppose, and think about some tangible examples. And maybe, Felipe, I'll pick on you first if you've got some, maybe an example or two to share where you think there's been a good sort of, responsible, human-centric, etc. application of AI in a business environment, so we could sort of have a sense of what we're talking about here in, I guess, real terms.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's, I'll pick on two examples, one more from our research and one from conversation, actually, that even came to the fore yesterday. And on the research and tangible application, actually, Natalia helped me with this. We were playing with natural language processing aspects in a chatbot, in a consumer service aspect, right? So this is a machine learning process where what we have is a service agent that is fake, that is just going and actually handling consumer complaints, consumer questions, etc. Right? And largely the functionality and the need for that relies on the modeling of the language underneath it. And the problem that we ran into was that the bulk of the advancement in the science underneath that capability was developed in English. Now, when you go and you deploy it, we were looking at just simply like a very complex change, right? Like just going to Germany. Suddenly the ability to detect emotion and handle consumers appropriately kind of became more difficult and goes out the window. And I had to rely then on Natalia, and I don't even know how many hours we spent on developing new ways of doing the NLP in German. But then it just pointed to a specific issue. If you're developing this and you have different turn of phrases and languages within your same domain, your same area, where maybe some part of your customer base is actually relying on an algorithm that is essentially coded for their language, and another set and the data underneath it is going through a second processing, like a multi-language model that essentially translates it to English before it gets responded, you're going to have diverging paths for those in terms of experience for those individuals. So potentially the consequence, at the very least, the satisfaction can be in very different ways. And we see that a lot with people trying to talk to Alexa, right, or Siri, and not being understood, right? Like that's a very basic example. But imagine it in terms of the entire grounding of it was designed in a completely foreign language. And I've had similar conversations as a Saudi telecom had to develop their entire framework and everything they do from the ground up because there was nothing they could just deploy. The other one that I really like that came from discussions yesterday came from that this is not always a problem, but there's actually some potential for value. In conversation with some banking leaders, global banking leaders, we were talking about data transparency and how you gave transparency for customers in how you're using their data, how you're aggregating their data and combining it to make decisions. It turns out that actually that aggregation, that combination, and that parsing of your data and providing it back to you as the customer was of extreme high value for the customer themselves in managing their financial well-being. So suddenly your own process of being transparent became a differentiator and a source of value for the banks that are feeding back the underlying clean data, right, that you're using for your AI process and just saying, here's what we're using, here's what we know about you, here's how your expenses are lining up. And suddenly your data assets that you've kind of had to massage and manage for your AI applications and finance are actually a very good pro-customer, pro-human, like financial planning service that just becomes part of the bank offer.
So I'll give you another example actually about financial services, because I think it's just as a counterpoint to that where sometimes it can go awry. Because I think if we're trying to think about responsible and good uses of AI in business, we should probably think about where, those risks come true, so to speak, as you talked about, Felipe. And it's actually in sort of what machine learning, I guess we call feature engineering, where it's not just looking at, say, one signal in say, a customer's credit card transaction data, but it's kind of looking at an amalgamation of multiple pieces of data and inferring something from that, and then using that, let's say, for sort of a decisioning algorithm on whether or not to give someone a mortgage, things like that. Now, this is a regulated, depending on the country, I should say, a regulated industry, and regulated in the sense of how these decisions get made. But that lack of explainability sometimes in how a more sophisticated neural network, for example, would sort of pull together seemingly irrelevant, unrelated features or variables in data sets, and then sort of mash them together to develop just a better prediction of someone's likelihood of defaulting on a mortgage, let's say, can ultimately cause some problems. And part of that becomes the training data set. So, I'm sure many of you are familiar with all sorts of examples that we see in the press from time to time about, algorithmic bias, where, people don't program these algorithms to, for example, be racist or sexist or biased in some other meaningful way, but they happen to get out of control and become like that in terms of the outputs. And this is a big issue in financial services, where they are trying to automate a lot of these decisions, trying to bring in more data, use their data assets, use their resources, to improve the sort of the underpinning business model, the risk model of a business proposition. But then you run the risk of actually not knowing kind of, I think about it as sort of like you're baking a cake, it tastes really good or it tastes disgusting, but you don't know what ingredients really went into it and how they reacted with each other. And it's not that easy to kind of then, obviously unbake the cake. So I think this becomes a practical challenge for businesses. And you can see lots of examples in many industries, but financial services is one of them where that doesn't work out so well. But people are, smart people are working on these things. I wanted to come now, though, to a question that James Crocker had posted, because I was going to come to you, Sophie, and ask you about sort of regulation and privacy and sort of a more global perspective as well. So I think it fits nicely. James is asking, how do we see the global growth of privacy regulation affecting the value of AI for marketing? But I think there's a broader point there that maybe we can start with, just around the global aspect, because Felipe, your example before about the language and the difficulties of moving outside of English or in natural language processing is probably not an uncommon problem in lots of different ways, whether we're talking about language or we're talking about other differences between people, in different parts of the world. So, Sophie, given that you're, representing a very global international organization, I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on sort of the rollout of AI and related technologies around the world, and how sort of a more Western English-centric perspective might actually be problematic in certain parts of the world.
That's a really easy question.
We're just dealing with the easiest topics in the world today.
Okay, yeah, did we come to a really easy start? Thank you for that. No, all kidding aside. Actually, I think the timing is really interesting because, Andrew, you and I saw each other not long ago because we took part in a roundtable. You kindly agreed to take part in a roundtable event that we organized last Friday with UNESCO. Because for those of you who don't know, UNESCO is just picking up the very easy challenge of rolling out recommendations on the ethical use of AI at the global scale. So I think that this is a really interesting initiative, a timely initiative, because as I was complaining not long ago, there is a plethora of different initiatives and all of them are valid. It's really not up to me or ICC to judge or to rate them. They've all, their genesis and their rationale is different, and they've attempted to address challenges, regional or local challenges, and that's fine. Here, UNESCO has a very ambitious perspective of wanting to have this global language, if I can put it that way. They've brought together all of their member states, including states that have withdrawn from UNESCO, but they're still engaging with them, brought them along, brought in AI experts, carved out this recommendation that's gone through quite a few iterations now. And last Friday, we had this first roundtable where indeed UNESCO is putting this language back out to the community, to global society, and asking, namely, business, what do you think? How does this actually work for you? What are the issues around the language, the implementation? What is missing from a business perspective? How can you help us further refine and make these recommendations more granular, given the experience that you have, the case studies that you can share with us. And so I think it's the timeline is I think relatively ambitious, given what they're trying to do. Ultimately, these recommendations are meant to be adopted by member states next year in November 2021. That feels like a long time away, but I think given the how ambitious what they're trying to do is, I think that's what is needed. We at the International Chamber of Commerce are partnering with UNESCO to do this because we think it's just a very good opportunity, first of all, to reach out to national committees. So we are a trade association, and our members are basically trade associations. You have the Chamber of Commerce in the UK, in France, in Italy, all over the world. And these are who we represent, and their membership are basically local, national, international organizations. And with this exercise comes an opportunity for us, which we see as being really important. And it's a bit akin to what's happening today, perhaps, and that's around capacity building. That's about rolling out some information about what you've asked Natalia. First of all, what is AI? Let's understand this. Let's understand what the jargon is. Let's create this common knowledge that I was talking about at the beginning of our webinar today. And I think that's going to be really critical. I think it's also going to be critical to have a relatively flexible framework. As you were saying, Andrew, we do need a little bit of guidance when we go out onto that road so that we don't kill one another. If we make it very rigid, that could stifle innovation. Given that regulation is always behind innovation, that could also, we could be regulating things or attempting to regulate things we are not even aware of yet. And as Felipe has very eloquently put, there are quite a few unintended consequences that we're just starting to identify. So I think, this, I don't want to point to UNESCO as being the only avenue, the only opportunity to work on this, but I think it's an interesting one that's very topical, and certainly among those that we're working with. We obviously partner with the OECD and with the European Union, and I think just any major stakeholder is a stakeholder that we want to engage with, because ultimately we have to find a multi-stakeholder approach that allows the regulators to talk to the developers and to talk to the companies that are implementing, and also bringing on board the consumers, because I think that feedback loop is really critical, and one that we are absolutely committed to bringing into the discussions.
Yeah, I think, I mean, I want to talk about actually the question that James posted about advertising and marketing specifically with regulation, but actually just that consumer feedback loop aspect, I think, is really, really important. And maybe sort of, now that you mention it, underplayed a bit when we think about this. Not just say from the algorithms need to learn, but I think for businesses to actually get feedback. I mean, actually, Felipe, you talked about chatbots. Well, I was having fun yesterday morning with a banking chatbot because they'd paid my credit card twice instead of once, which is never a fun thing to wake up to. And other than sort of the how satisfied were you with this chat experience, there wasn't really a lot of feedback, right? And so sort of a 0 to 10 or a 1 to 5, 1 star, 2 stars, etc. piece of consumer feedback, I think, in those systems maybe not enough, because I think it only operates within the kind of the existing context, whereas I think there's a need for a lot richer feedback, and maybe that's one takeaway actually for businesses who are working in this space, is have really, robust, and I'm not going to say elaborate, but I think maybe robust is the right word, systems for getting feedback from your customers when they're interacting with these systems, whether they're sort of consumer facing like a chatbot, or it just so happens that the decision on something was made by an algorithm, and to see how that played out for the customer, because I think there's a lot to be learned there by listening to. If we want to be human centric, then I think we probably need to listen to the humans. So I want to come back to now the regulation aspect and privacy, and then we'll come to you, Natalia, with some other examples from industry that I know you were going to share. But just since we talked, or James raised this question, I mean, the privacy regulation, how that interacts with AI and marketing. And I know, Felipe, you've written a lot about this as well. So maybe I'll say something and then hand it over to you. But I think it doesn't necessarily change the growth of AI being used in marketing, particularly for ad targeting. I think it just changes the nature of the input data sets that you might have available to you. So a push more towards properly permissioned first-party data, CCPR or GDPR or similar compliant, those sorts of things. It doesn't. It affects the nature of the data that you might be able to use in a marketing or an advertising context. But I think the application then of machine learning and AI to those data sets on customers for these purposes is only increasing, I would say. But Felipe, what's your sense of that?
Yeah, and maybe I'll start with a promise that I'll share the paper. So I just published a paper on this year, so I'll share it on the network. So it'd be a good old academic paper, but hopefully legible still. But I think the value only increases, and actually what it is doing, what we see doing, is actually it positions then AI as a much stronger actual battleground for strategic competition between firms. The ones that have the ability to run the best systems, and the ones that have the ability to leverage AI in its applications, compared to those that have been starved of the data that they need to be able to deploy these technologies. So what we see, and you can start actually just looking in the marketplace and say, why are so many businesses suddenly being so pro-privacy and adapting these strategies to say, hey, I'm going to curtail data sharing? It's because they actually are sitting on a tremendous amount of very valuable data, first party, as Andrew mentioned, and increasing the data cost for all potential competitors. So what you're seeing now is this, not to go too on the economy side, but like monopoly level profits that you can extract out of the environment, because you're the only one now with the ability to run these models, and you're using privacy, which sometimes consumers ask for, sometimes they frankly don't. For better or for worse, I tend to be a more pro-privacy person than not. But the strategy side and the business side is to give people privacy, even if they don't want to, provided you have that data. Because then you have access to all of the beautiful modeling that Natalia can do, and you're going to make tons of money with that, while your competitors are using averages, population averages, and just approximations, and over time they can't compete. So it's a very good strategy.
And I mean, I think that plays out actually to give you an example, which is actually what someone had mentioned in the Q&A, which we'll come to in more detail soon, but about high frequency trading, right? So that is all about taking advantage of even basically a minuscule data and time advantage to make gains in trading, and we see that sort of the norm in the financial markets. So So I think there is a competitive advantage to be had by thinking about more unique or sophisticated ways to use data that is uniquely your data, or data that you're, gathering appropriately from your customers, and not necessarily data that's just out there for everybody. I think that can be beneficial. So I think, regulations will come. Regulations are here. They come and go, or they change. But I think the uses of these technologies from an analytics standpoint, if nothing else, is only increasingly sophisticated. On that note, Natalia, I want to ask you if you've got some examples you want to share of either, good, responsible, or less so applications of AI in business.
Well, I want to give two examples here. Well, first, probably I will start with less responsible use of AI, let's call it like this, but it all comes down to GDPR regulations. So I work with companies in different countries and respectively different GDPR regulations. And it's very easy to see the consequence of these regulations on small and medium businesses. Let's not touch large organizations or academia. And we see a huge discrepancy here between the countries that we, in which GDPR regulations are more strict versus the countries where it's more relaxed. And the reason, as Andrew mentioned, is that you cannot get enough data if you have these regulations on place and you don't have access to people or to capital. And for example, if you're working in such fields as face and motion recognition, or even eye tracking. Imagine you are a very, very small business and you're running your small research and you want to collect data from eye tracking. It's much easier to do in countries where users are more happier to participate in an experiment for a small fee, and they don't have to go through very lengthy contracts that need to be signed, and the data has to have certain hardware to be stored, and so on and so forth. So we will have much more research in big companies, and the outcomes for the small and medium businesses as well. We're not doing good research, we're not doing very well, and the gap between different types of businesses is growing. And another case is when we look at things like large-scale eye tracking. For example, you can do only lab experiments if you want to do it when you comply with GDPR. Whereas in countries with less strict regulations, you just can run an app and gather all the data you need. And somewhere you don't even have to declare it. And many organizations use this, the fact that you don't have to declare these things, and do a lot of research. For best or for worst, we really don't know. It's not very well studied yet, and that's why research that Felipe is doing is so important, that we can actually track the consequences and understand how it's applied to different businesses. So another case that we can talk about is like natural language processing applications and chatbots, and for example, Twitter sentiment analysis. If we do have too many regulations, we cannot do much. We cannot easily download the data. We cannot easily process the data. We cannot get as good insights. We have less material to study, and it's just really slows things down. So there are good things and bad things. And I personally believe that privacy and regulations is a very good thing. In terms, it slows progress a bit, but on the other hand, it allows us to do research correctly, like kind of more in a more supervised way.
Which is a good thing. I want to come to a question that, and I know we're almost out of time, but there was an interesting question from Paul, which is, how will interactions with AI change human behavior in response, both that of consumers and corporate executives? again, it's not a simple, easily answered question, but I think it's a good way for us to think about, consequences, unintended or otherwise, of AI systems in business could also actually change behaviors or change expectations, subsequent expectations that, let's say, consumers have, or change how executives make decisions, and so on. I don't know. So where we would start with this one, but maybe Felipe, if I come to you first, and then Sophie second, for any sort of quick thoughts on the behavior change aspect.
Yeah, I'll have one on each side. Maybe one with a warning, one with maybe more hopeful. And we've been discussing a lot about, actually for years, I think in class we've been talking about consumer outsourcing of decision making, right? And like algorithmic thinking. So you can think that, like, in a world where the stuff actually works really well, it will not be at all unusual for a human to make that decision once and then just automate it and allow the system to take care of it. So some areas of human consumption are going to become a lot more outsourced. Once they make the decision, it's going to be very difficult for you to win that business back, because it's going to be on that subscription box style. Like, it's just going to keep happening until you give them a jolt to get them out of that system and thinking about their choices again. So things are about to get a lot stickier, because we're going to just stick with whatever we do, and it's going to be maintained incredibly well by an algorithm. That's on the consumption side. On the leadership side, one of the issues that I normally see, and this is not an attack, this is a human condition, but one of the things that I see very often teaching MBAs and just teaching executives and so on, eventually we get overwhelmed by the dimensions of the problems that we deal with. And we try to go for something some heuristics or sufficiency, right? Like, I have thought about this enough. There's enough links to this chain that maybe this is already, like, I don't want to think about this anymore. Let's make a decision. I think these systems will help us to map our reality a bit better, because they're not overwhelmed by complexity. They are going to potentially present us with better understanding of the world. When we talk about ethics and we talk about responsible use of the technology, one of the advantages might be that it's so hard to think about all of the possible consequences. These systems could actually help us understand all of the knock-on consequences. So we could just end up in a system that, like, the augmented decision-making aspect of AI could be that you don't have to just rely on human heuristic satisficing ideas of just saying, yeah, I have thought about this enough. You're given more fuel to actually make better decision makings, and you're augmented to come to better decisions. So hopefully more positive outcomes.
I like the term augmented intelligence. I know you and I both like that a lot. So Sophie, what do you think, maybe from the executive and a managerial decision-making standpoint here? How might using these systems change how decisions are made?
I was actually thinking of another example, if I could just share that with you very quickly, because I was going to talk to you about an area that you may not expect ICC to be very active in, and that's in health. Because we have recently partnered with the World Health Organization. Already in April, we had worked with them in order to develop a global survey that we sent out to our full membership. That's right, our full membership, in order to have a better understanding of their understanding and their implementation of the WHO recommendations back then. I know that feels like a lifetime ago, but it was really important to understand whether the social distancing concept, which we've now become all very familiar with, unfortunately, and everything that came with that, and protecting the employees, etc., was understood. That led to quite a few new partnerships and areas of work that the ICC has never been involved in before, and namely partnerships with medical agencies, universities, and we've worked a lot with university hospitals that have used AI powered by deep learning algorithms to really better understand how to very quickly diagnose people who have COVID just by reading chest x-rays. And so having that type of knowledge was augmented intelligence or augmented decision making, because it helped support healthcare professionals who were in dire situations, extremely stretched, to develop their knowledge of a completely new disease area, and to be able to treat patients much better. We have worked in particular with a hospital that is based in Belgium, that is one of the WHO centers for excellence, and they estimate that they were able to increase their diagnosis accuracy by 94% in a very short period of time, which saved lives. So I think, it's obviously not what you're asking me here, but I did want to share that with you because we were a witness to this, and we were able to see what AI deep learning algorithms was able to bring, and also how that helped to support healthcare infrastructure that was incredibly stretched, with better health outcomes for patients. Otherwise, in terms of, I also want to share, if I could, an example of a very large telecoms company, global one that we work with. And before this webinar, I put to them, okay, how are you actually implementing, AI, and what does it mean for you as a business? And they've told me that they've taken a very proactive approach, and that they have developed AI principles which they're using internally. I think this will be music to our ears, because they are using some of the language and the concepts that we have identified in the research that we've done, and they've articulated it around the 5 fundamental principles, which are around fairness, transparency and explainability, human centricity, privacy and security by design, and then working in partnership with stakeholders. I think it's really worth highlighting this, because as Natalia was saying, I think the larger companies do have more means to do research. They have more means to be proactive. And I think they also have the capacity, and some of them have the commitment to also shape the AI landscape. And by being very proactive, this company developed these principles quite a few years back, and I think that's also critical. Without wanting to name them, but I don't think I can really get away with it, I also wanted to share with you something that Microsoft and Google are doing. Microsoft has launched the AI Business School, which you may be familiar with, and there's also Google AI. And this, in terms of capacity building, I think is also critical, going back to the consumer, going back to the user, going back to everybody who is going to be using, developing, and just being confronted with AI, and just being more aware of what it is. And I think that could help perhaps have a better understanding of what AI means to people in their everyday lives.
Yeah, and on that point of capacity building, I think it's a skills thing too, which we could have a whole other webinar on. But I think, we're seeing corporations like Microsoft and Google, essentially launching, academies or training programs, or providing a lot of content to help people upskill themselves. And of course, you see the likes of ourselves, business schools, and we've got an open program on AI, and we've just announced, which will start in February, a year-long part-time executive diploma, so an actual Oxford degree on AI for business. So I think we're going to see this need of big corporations that are leading the charge on the technology development, plus academic institutions like ourselves, helping in the sort of the reskilling or the upskilling or the capacity building of the human capital required to sort of implement, monitor, and work alongside in that augmented intelligence way with all these systems. We are pretty much out of time. So as I said, we could talk much more about this, and I think we'll definitely have more Oxford Digital Leaders Network webinars, which happen every month, more around these sorts of topics. And I saw sort of some late questions come into the chat around things like algorithmic bias and more regulation-related questions, other applications, say in HR, and so apologies we couldn't get to those questions, but we certainly I'm sure will at a future date. And if you want to join the LinkedIn group, then we can certainly take that discussion into that environment. But right now, I just want to, I've got a few concluding remarks, but first, I want to say thanks to Sophie, Natalia, and Felipe for spending time with us today and sharing their thoughts and perspectives. As I said, there's a lot to unpack in this topic, and we really, I guess, decided to rather ambitiously tackle some of the really trickier questions around this, for which there are no clear-cut answers. But I think it's these sorts of dialogues and looking for these case studies, looking for the examples at both ends of the spectrum, sort of successful and not, that helps us really learn and actually take action on figuring out how we make the best use in the best possible ways of AI in all sorts of business. So